You know the story. A curious girl tumbles down a rabbit hole, meets a talking rabbit in a waistcoat, attends a tea party hosted by someone who's definitely unwell, and navigates a world where logic goes to die. For more than a century, Alice in Wonderland has been packaged as charming nonsense, a sugary, whimsical children's classic. But here's the thing most people never hear. The real origins of this story are far older, far darker, and far more unsettling than the version that ends up on kids' bookshelves. And once you understand what Lewis Carroll, aka Charles Dodgson, was actually surrounded by, influenced by, and quietly critiquing, you'll never see this fantasy the same way again. So, before we get too deep into the madness, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment if you're ready for a trip into the shadows behind Wonderland. Because the truth is, Alice in Wonderland isn't just quirky imagination, it's a grenade wrapped in whimsy, a cultural bomb Carroll smuggled into the Victorian nursery under the disguise of a fairy tale. And buried in its pages are some of the darkest secrets of Victorian England, encoded behind grins, riddles, and teacups that shake for a very real reason. It all starts innocently enough. Summer afternoon, 1862. Dodgson is rowing down the Thames with three sisters, including one 10-year-old Alice Little, bright, curious, restless. She begs him to make up a nonsense story on the spot. He obliges. Cute, right? A wholesome origin story. But here's where the whole narrative starts cracking like an eggshell under a boot. When Dodgson died, decades later, his family went through his personal diaries and did something extremely suspicious. They didn't just review his journals, they physically removed pages, cut them out with scissors. Entire entries gone forever. And the pages they took? Specifically the ones covering the period when he was closest to Alice Little and writing the original story, meant just for her. Imagine being in that study right after the funeral, the room still smelling like pipe smoke and old books. His sisters opening the diary to June 27, 1863, reading something that makes the whole room go still. No words, just the sound of scissors slicing through the pages. Some accounts say the pages were burned, names like Alice and Liddell flickering in the firelight before the paper curled into ash. Whatever they saw, they took to their graves. That silence is louder than anything Carroll ever wrote, and that erasure, that deliberate destruction, casts a permanent shadow over the man who gave us Wonderland. Because Dodgson wasn't just a shy mathematician, he had an unusual number of friendships with prepubescent girls. He photographed them, wrote them elaborate letters, sent handwritten stories. Even in Victorian society, which had a very different standard for social boundaries, people raised eyebrows. Without those missing pages, his biggest biographical puzzle stays unsolved. Was Carroll simply awkward and overly sentimental? Or was something more complicated going on? The truth is now as foggy as Carroll's clouded looking-glass. And while the private life remains murky, the writing tells its own story. The first version of Alice, written as a gift for Alice Little, was sweet, personal, and relatively gentle. But when Carroll decided to publish it for the masses, he didn't just expand it, he darkened it. A lot. Some of the most disturbing scenes, like the Duchess's baby turning into a pig or the chaotic, nightmarish tea party, weren't in the original. He inserted them later. These additions weren't random whimsy, they were commentary. Take Alice's constant eating and drinking of mysterious substances that cause her body to shift uncontrollably. People love to claim it's about psychedelics, that Carroll was tripping a century early. Fun take, but wrong. The real Victorian influence is much more disturbing and much more common. Opium. Victorian England was practically swimming in it. Laudanum, liquid opium, was a household staple, not a drug for rebels, a drug for mothers, workers, doctors, and babies. Yes, babies. Everyone knew someone using it because it was sold as casually as cough syrup. Historical records show 5 out of 6 families used it regularly. And that's where the dark mirror between Wonderland and the real world becomes chilling. One real case from 1854 tells the story of Sarah Whitfield, a factory worker who gave her 6-month-old baby a spoonful of Godfrey's cordial, a syrup literally made of opium, every night to keep him quiet while she worked grueling shifts. One morning she found him cold and blue. Coroner called it accidental poisoning. Dozens of cases like that happened every month. Another popular product, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed with cherub-faced babies on the label, contained enough morphine sulfate to knock out an adult. So when Carroll shows Alice casually ingesting unknown substances, shrinking, growing, feeling her body distort, he wasn't thinking about hallucinogens. He was reflecting something every Victorian adult knew, the terrifyingly casual way their society drugged its children. And it doesn't stop there. Remember the baby that transforms into a pig? Not random. Medical reports from the time described children poisoned by laudanum as literally shriveling and deforming, their limbs thinning, their faces sinking, becoming skeletal. Doctors said these drugged infants shrank up like little old men. Carroll didn't need psychedelics for that imagery. He had reality. But if you think that's the worst hidden horror in Wonderland, wait until we get to the Mad Hatter. The Mad Hatter is not just a silly character. He is a direct reference to an actual occupational disease. Mad as a hatter wasn't a quirky saying. It was a diagnosis. Hat factories used mercury nitrate to treat rabbit fur into felt, and workers, breathing in mercury vapor day after day, were slowly poisoned. Their hands shook uncontrollably, their speech slurred, their personalities changed, hallucinations, emotional instability, and erratic behavior became common. Imagine shaking so violently at lunchtime that you can't hold a spoon. One worker from an 1860s hat factory in Stockport, Thomas Corbett, suffered tremors so severe he couldn't eat. By the end, he was hallucinating giant rabbits in the corners of the workshop. His co-workers mocked him as mad. No one helped. The factory replaced him a week after he collapsed. His family got nothing. And here's the kicker. The government, the public, the industry, everyone knew mercury was poisoning people. But the practice wasn't banned until 1941, nearly 80 years after Carroll created the Mad Hatter. Why banned then? Not to save workers' lives. The military needed mercury for detonators. Once you know that, the Mad Hatter's Eternal Tea Party isn't quirky. It's a workplace horror story hidden under layers of whimsy. A coded protest. Carroll wasn't just writing nonsense, he was writing about the victims of a system that chewed up workers and tossed them aside. And then there's the Queen of Hearts, an over-the-top tyrant screaming, "Off with their heads," every 5 minutes. Seems silly. But Carroll's Victorian audience knew exactly what he was referencing. The entire rose painting scene, loaded with history. The red rose symbolized the House of Lancaster, the white rose, the House of York. Their rivalry fueled the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest eras in English history. People were executed simply for wearing the wrong color, literally. In 1461, the Battle of Towton left 28,000 men dead in the snow, the bloodiest day in English history. At Tewkesbury, Lancaster supporters dragged from sanctuary were beheaded on the spot. The Duke of Somerset was executed so quickly, his blood flowed into the street gutters. When the gardeners paint white roses red, Victorian readers knew exactly what was being said. Political survival often meant choosing the right symbol before the Queen noticed. And every time the Queen of Hearts calls for another beheading, Carroll is pointing out the arbitrary, centuries-long brutality of English monarchy. Victorian society claimed it was civilized, lawful, rational. Carroll pointed at that self-image and basically said, "Really? Because this still looks like the same old tyranny wearing a nicer hat." And then there's Carroll's savage takedown of the Victorian education system. Picture classrooms where children recited moral poems and multiplication tables with military precision, punished for asking questions. The goal wasn't understanding, it was obedience. Memorization was morality. Curiosity was trouble. So Carroll shows Alice trying to recite her lessons in Wonderland and failing miserably. 4 times 5 is 12. 4 times 6 is 13. Sounds like a child panicking, right? But Carroll, the mathematician, secretly made the math technically correct in other number bases. This was a jab at the increasingly abstract math of Oxford, accessible only to academics, meaningless to the average person. Alice's identity crisis, who in the world am I? hits right when her memorized lessons collapse. Carroll's message is blunt. If your entire education is memorization without understanding, the moment reality bends even slightly, your mental world breaks apart. And that chaotic courtroom at the end? Complete nonsense by design. Evidence doesn't matter. Logic is punished. Verdicts depend on the Queen's mood. Sounds wild, right? Except Victorian courts weren't much better. One real case involved Mary Barrett, a starving seamstress who stole a loaf of bread worth 3 pence. She was sentenced to 6 months' hard labor and died in prison within weeks. In the same court, on the same week, the son of an aristocrat brutally assaulted a housemaid. Witnesses testified against him. He paid a fine less than his daily breakfast and walked free. Wonderland's courtroom isn't far-fetched satire. It's barely an exaggeration. So when Alice finally stands up and says, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," it's not just a child calling out imaginary characters. It's Carroll revealing what he believed about the Victorian systems propped up as unshakable truths. Behind the robes, behind the crowns, behind the rituals, there was nothing. Just people abusing power because they could. And that, honestly, is why Alice in Wonderland endures. Kids see a fun adventure. Adults see satire. Historians see a coded map of Victorian nightmares. But the deepest layer? The one most people miss? Carroll used fantasy as camouflage, masking criticism so sharp it could have destroyed him if he'd written it plainly. And the missing diary pages, well, those make the shadows even darker. So the next time someone chirps that Alice in Wonderland is just a cute children's story about imagination and whimsy, remember this. Sometimes the only way to reveal the truth is through nonsense. And sometimes the only way to expose a broken world is to let a confused little girl wander through one that looks exactly the same, just with the mask ripped off.